Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is our final plenary session of the day, and we are going to talk under the theme of International Aid, World Order, and Korea's Leadership in the Age of Multi-polarization. And the moderator for this session is Chairman Oh Yoon-dae for the Presidential Council on Nation Branding. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome him up to the podium with warm hands.
I've been informed that our last session will last for 75 minutes. And then each speaker will deliver a speech for 20 minutes, preferably 80 minutes. And then later on, we'll have discuss among us for 15 minutes. And if there is any questions and recommendation coming from floor, we'll try to accommodate. As you know, the world is changing. And we are saying that the current financial meltdown is worst in last 60 years. Definitely, we expecting that many things will be changed in terms of order of economic and political arena of the world. Unfortunately, if you look at the case of China, economic growth in this year are expected to become 8%, and even India 6%. Because of those bigger emerging countries' economic comeback, world economy is getting better, together with a lot of helicopter money coming from United States providing by monetary board there. And in case of Korea, and during this kind of process, in a sense, Korean political result has been aborted because of invitation of G20 group of 20 meeting, which will be held next year, November, in Seoul. We consider that's very important because G20, G8, in a sense, will be transformed into G20, where the Korea can play a very important role in logistic and agenda setting. And with those kind of in mind, we'll discuss about what will happen in political and economic world after this world financial meltdown, and what Korea could do for the better of the world. We have, fortunately, three eminent speakers from all over the world. Three gentlemen from here, my left side, I will introduce. Dr. John Eikenberry. He is Albert G. Milbank Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University in the Department of Politics and Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Professor Eikenberry is co-director of Princeton Project on Nation Security. Among his many activities, Professor Eikenberry served as a member of an advisory group at the State Department in 2003 to 2004 and was a member of Council on Foreign Relations Task Forces on U.S.-European relations. He is also a reviewer of books on political and legal affairs for foreign affairs. Professor Eikenberry. And next to him is Nicholas Burnett, is Managing Director of the Result for Development Institute with responsibility for its education program. Until October 2009, Burnett was Assistant Director General for Education at the United Nations Educational, Cultural, Scientific Organization, that is UNESCO, responsible for its education work at its Paris headquarters. He also Special Professor of International Education Policy at the University of Nottingham in the United Kingdom. Bennett joined Result for Development Institute after a distinguished career including UNESCO, the World Bank, the British government, and his own consulting firm. He was educated as economist at Oxford, Harvard, and Johns Hopkins later on. Please. And gentleman next to him is Emanuel Jimenez. He has been an economist and manager in the policy and research and operational unit of the World Bank. Since early 2002, he has been Sector Director, Human Development in the World Bank's East Asia region. He recently took time off from his operational duties to lead the team that prepares Bank's flagship publication, the World Development Report 2007 and 2008. He also serves as current editor of the journal, the World Bank Research Observer. Before joining the World Bank, Mr. Jimenez was on the Faculty of Economics Department at the University of Western Ontario in London, Canada.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here. And my assignment was to give a very broad picture of the way the world is evolving today. And within that context, we'll talk about foreign aid, economics, and Korea's role in the world. So I'll try to set the picture in a very broad perspective to get started. Obviously, we live in interesting times, and there is a great deal of discussion about what kind of international order that we are moving into. There's a very strong sense around the world that we're in a period of transition from one order into a new order. Big questions are being asked around the world. What is the shape of the coming international system? What is the security environment? What is the economic environment that we are entering into? In the background are big, weighty questions really about what sort of historical moment we are in. Is this the end of the post-war period where the U.S. was dominant? Is this a return to the 1930s and the kind of closed, economic crisis-laden era that really was the beginning of World War II? Or is this the 19th century where great powers sparred for and were rival powers on the global stage? There's lots of speculation, and let me speak a little bit about that. But many people see change coming. Henry Kissinger said not so long ago that he had not seen the world in such a state of flux with so few agreed upon rules and norms to guide the flow of change. The National Intelligence Council, an American organization dedicated to thinking about the future, has just published its Global Trends 2025, looking out to 2025, and sees what it calls a return to multipolarity. This is the master trend that we have in front of us, multipolarity, from unipolarity, a one superpower world, to a multipolar world. And along the way, we will see a diffusion of power away from the U.S. and away from its specific allies, towards new poles, such as China, perhaps Russia, and the return of rivalry that we associate with the 19th century. Others see a divide coming really between East and West, between what are described by some, such as Robert Kagan, as the new autocratic states, the authoritarian states, that are capitalist, market-oriented, but very much non-democratic, China and Russia again, and the so-called capitalist liberal states, the democracies, that have a very different orientation. So in this view, we are moving into a period where Russia and China will be, in effect, the center of a camp, and the democracies will be part of a different camp. These autocratic capitalist states are like the old capitalist states of the autocratic states of the earlier period, in that they are hostile to the West and to democracy, but they're new in that they are very resilient. They are, in effect, capable of operating within a world capitalist system. Some see China as the epicenter, if you will, for a new world order. Martin Jack, a new book that's just come out called When China Rules the World, really describes the coming of a new hegemon, a new superpower that will create a new world order around a very different political economy and security system. So there is a lot of worry afoot and a lot of sense of change. Add to this the recent financial crisis where really for the first time in the post-war period, the U.S. was not the stabilizer of that order, but rather was the epicenter of the crisis itself, with the financial crisis, the savings and loan crisis before it. So these are all stories about the future that suggest crisis and conflict is coming. I want to be somewhat more skeptical in my minutes here today. I want to argue that there's reason to be optimistic, really, about new forms of cooperation where Korea can be an important part of this new system of greater cooperation. In particular, I want to argue that the pathway to the future still resides along a path that runs along and through the institutions and relationships created over the last 50 years. U.S. power may decline, but a new Cold War, a new division is not inevitable. In fact, it's not likely. In the years ahead, the world will have opportunity to build a lot of new and more intensive forms of networks and institutions of cooperation. The G20, which Korea is very much involved in, is in some sense emblematic of this new architecture that I think is around the corner. But before we talk about the future, I want to say something about the old order that's leaving us, and say something about it because it's not entirely leaving us. There are still parts of the old order that will be around to help guide the future. When I say the old order, of course, I mean that American-led order of 60 years, built after World War II, organized around open trade, multilateral institutions, cooperative security, alliance partnership, democratic solidarity, and U.S. hegemonic leadership. This is an order that has been around for 60 years. It's anchored in big institutions, NATO, the UN, Bretton Woods, the economic institutions, the WTO, perhaps the most successful international institution operating today, the G7, and now the G20. In the background, there are bargains and institutions that help create and sustain this order. The U.S. has provided security through its alliances, for example, and until recently been the real vanguard of economic stabilization and openness. This old order also has been a remarkably successful order, and before we say goodbye to it, we might want to pause and think a little bit about what it has done over the last 50, 60 years. It's opened the world economy after World War II, ushering in the golden age of economic growth. It integrated Germany and Japan, two countries that were hostile to liberal capitalism, but that became part of really the center of this system in the post-war period. It brought transitioning countries into this order. Over the last 30 years, 500 million people were lifted out of poverty and brought into this system. It peacefully ended the Cold War. It's 20 years ago this coming Monday when the Berlin Wall went down, and we saw the possibility of peaceful change, integration, building and deepening the institutions rather than tearing them apart. There's also reason to think that this order is not entirely going to disappear, and there are a variety of reasons why. First of all, thankfully, we aren't in a period where great power war is likely. That is to say, we aren't in a period where even the countries that are not totally friendly, and certainly not alliance partners, Russia, China on the one hand, and the American alliances on the other, are not at a point where they're going to go to war. This is because of nuclear deterrence. It's because of the dominance of democracies. It's because war doesn't produce benefit as it might have done in earlier eras. This is also an order, this liberal international order, that is remarkably adaptive and integrative. It's easy to join. Countries have been integrating into it for a long time. Moreover, rising states don't constitute a bloc. We have a lot of rising states. Korea, obviously China, Brazil, South Africa, many countries around the world, but they are not a kind of hostile bloc that is trying to overturn the current system. So overall, there's reason to think that The system in some ways is working. Countries are rising up, they're growing, they're modernizing, they're democratizing. Again, Korea is the epitome of this. And rival forms of cooperation around fascism and communism have fallen away. Now, the world is changing, and the old order is in need of change. And there are various reasons why this is so. The end of the Cold War obviously was one of them, where we've had a change of security realities really for the current world order. We no longer have a Cold War. The rise of the U.S. as a global power, unchallenged by other powers, has created new dilemmas really for world politics. We've never lived in a one superpower world before. The erosion of state sovereignty, the human rights revolution of the last 60 years. The international community now takes it upon itself to care more about what goes on inside of societies than it ever has in the past. So we have new questions about when do we intervene? How do we reconcile sovereignty and interdependence? The privatization of war, that is to say, the rise of the possibility of non-state actors that can gain violence capability and inflict great destruction on developed societies around the world. So we're at a point where new environmental conditions, globalization, increased economic interdependence, and security challenges shifting from the Cold War to diffuse challenges often associated with failed states rather than strong states creates new challenges for international cooperation. I think the most striking change that we have in front of us is the kind of master change of the 21st century, which we can call security interdependence. That is to say, increasingly, we have more people in more places that have an impact potentially on the way we live and the way we conduct our lives. In the 21st century, it's not just a rival superpower that has nuclear weapons that challenges us. It's people around the world in all different sorts of settings that are linked together in all sorts of new ways, and positive ways through interdependence, but threatening ways such as, again, terrorism through small gangs that achieve the ability to project violence capability, health pandemics, which can transnationally communicate disease across borders, energy security, which is increasingly putting demands on our systems, and environmental problems, global warming perhaps at the front of that are creating new challenges for international cooperation. So my takeaway from all of this is that, yes, the world is changing. Yes, new countries, new actors are involved in this new thing we call the modern international system, but that we are really at an exciting moment where lots of new actors are going to be able to have a role in shaping those rules and institutions of the 21st century. If you look into the 21st century, it's hard to imagine that we aren't going to be pressured, if you will, to devise more complex forms of international cooperation to take advantage of the threats of the 21st century, but also the challenges of the 21st century. It won't just be big states, it will be medium-sized states. It will be the G20 rather than the G7 or G8. And it will be private citizens, NGOs, new forms of institutions that aren't formal like the WTO, but informal networks, coalitions of the willing, informal networks of public and private actors. So in the decades ahead, it's going to be exciting, but we are going to need to find new ways to work together. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Archambault. Actually, he has spent 15 minutes. Thank you very much for that also. Next, Dr. Burnett, please.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I will now try to complement what Professor Eichenberg said by moving to a very specific area, which is the area of international support, international aid for education. and I'll conclude with what some ideas about possible role for Korea. Overall, I will review the sort of volume, direction, and needs in aid for education. I'll look at some current trends, and I'll come to some important issues for the present and the future. First of all, while total aid for all sectors increased for the last year for which we have data, 2008, we've seen more generally a decline in aid for basic education and roughly a constancy in aid for education as a whole. And it remains the case that total aid for education, for basic education, is only about 5% of all the aid which is allocated by sector. There is also a lot of other aid which is allocated in terms of budgetary support and things of that nature. And this compares, approximately $4.5 billion, which is available for basic education, compares to a very conservative estimate of something like $11 billion is needed each year just to meet the education for all goals that were established at the turn of the century. There's been essentially no change in how this aid has been allocated over the first decade of this century. It remains going approximately half to low-income countries, approximately 40% to middle-income countries, and with a certain amount not allocated by a specific country. The picture's a little bit better in basic education, where the aid for the low-income countries is running around, was increasing, had gone up to 72% or so by the middle of this decade, but now appears to be falling, had dropped down to 60%. What seems clear is that low-income countries need a higher priority in the international aid for education. Roughly only half of all aid to education is committed to them, as I just indicated, and roughly only 60% was going to the 68 low-income countries. Is there a relationship between aid and progress on education? Answer, yes, but the time lags are naturally quite long. But we can see a clear, although somewhat weak, relationship between the provision of aid and the progress toward achieving education, at least when measured in terms of enrollments. A particular mechanism in international aid for education is the Fast Track Initiative, which was set up some 5 or 6 years ago to try to help improve the supply of aid for basic education in the low-income countries. It was a great idea, but I fear it has not been very successful. Its original idea had been to increase the funding for basic education through increased participation, increased actual levels of aid from donors already active in particular countries. This has not happened. Its original idea was to have its own small fund, which would be used to provide catalytic or initial financing for countries which did not benefit sufficiently from existing sources of international aid for education. This has also not happened. The catalytic fund has become the major source of extra finance, even for countries which were already benefiting from aid for basic education. And indeed, that fund itself has been essentially only financed through contributions from 2 major countries, the United Kingdom and the Netherlands. The governance structures of the Fast Track Initiative are very out of date, I can only say. They do not sufficiently, in my view, reflect the role and the importance of the recipient countries. In the same way that G8 has been moving towards G20, I believe some type of reform of the governance of this initiative is necessary. There's a particular issue also about how to provide aid to countries which are have been unstable, which have been in conflict and so on. How is this to be done? All of this is in very marked contrast to significant amounts of much larger finance which has been available for various international health issues. Let me now turn to 5 important trends. So the first is, I think you would expect me to discuss, what has happened as a result of the financial and economic crisis. What has happened to international aid for education? Most of the recipient countries of aid have very little fiscal space themselves to increase their spending on education unless aid can be increased. And I will show you some data on that. I will also show you some lessons from the past about how aid has been affected during previous less than global financial crises. And finally, I'd point out that for countries which have very high aid budgets, such as the Netherlands, which is providing over 1% of its GNP in aid, and within that is earmarked 15% for education. So the Netherlands is actually providing 0.15% of its GNP in aid for basic education, precisely because the Netherlands' GNP has itself fallen. Of course, the amount of aid has suddenly been cut. Just to look quickly at this fiscal capacity question. If we look at the low-income countries, we see that those which essentially lack sufficient fiscal space are most of them, as compared to something like 2/3 of the middle-income countries. This low fiscal space increases the constraints, particularly for countries which are already far from achieving universal basic education, however we define it. For example, of the list of 43 countries that the World Bank has identified as being extremely vulnerable, something like 32 have a long way to go to achieve universal primary education, and something like 27 have this limited fiscal space. So this is a worrying combination as a result of the financial and economic crisis. In particular, using an index which we had developed at the Education for All Monitoring Report at UNESCO, something like the majority of the countries which already had low scores on that index, i.e. countries that were far from achieving education for all, the majority of those countries also have very low fiscal space. So all of this just reinforces the importance of aid. And here you can see these particular countries. What about the past, lessons from the past? We know from the Japanese financial crisis in the 1990s that this resulted in its aid being cut. We know the same thing from the Nordic banking crisis also of the 1990s. So there's obviously a very high risk, just drawing on lessons of the recent past, that aid may be cut as donor countries struggle to deal with their own public expenditure and economic realities. The second trend I want to draw attention to is what I've called the increasing sovereignty of the recipient countries. Some 15 to 20 years ago, and I'm talking particularly here about in the education sector, but it probably applies more broadly, these countries were not playing a very major role with regard to the external funds that were being made available to them. But now there is considerable pressure that they should play this role. Of course, at the very broad level, as we heard our speakers this morning mention, there's the need to reform the governance of the World Bank, IMF, etc. Specifically within education, we have this fast-track initiative, which I've already spent some time on. We also have something run by UNESCO, organized by UNESCO on behalf of other UNESCO and other agencies, the Education for All high-level group. But in all these mechanisms, even though the developing recipient countries are very present, they have not been playing a very major role. These mechanisms have tended to be dominated by the donors. Particular issues also arise about how should they play this role, now when we're coming specifically to education, because of the question about who should represent the country in such fora. Should it be the Ministry of Finance, since money is involved? Should it be the Ministry of Education, since education is involved, etc.? The third trend I want to draw attention to has to do with the importance of emerging donors. First of all, some of the existing donors are now increasing their aid for education. This is contrary to some of my earlier worries about what might happen as a result of the financial crisis. But in particular, Spain and now the United States have clearly stated that they're going to increase their aid for basic education. We have, of course, the emerging economies, and we're standing here in Korea, which are beginning to emerge also as donors, and we're seeing this with all of them in education. We're seeing major program of Brazil in Africa, for example. We're seeing China also moving to provide support for education in Africa. Here we are in Korea, and I'll come back to the issues that Korea might want to consider. We have Russia beginning to support education also in many parts of the world through various multilateral mechanisms. We have the oil-rich states of the Persian Gulf, which are moving into education also in quite a significant way. Qatar, for example, is providing a lot of support now for countries which have emerged from conflict, that very issue I raised earlier. We have an emergence of foundations. I mentioned a few here, such as the Hewlett and MasterCard foundations. I don't know, are there any Korean foundations involved? I couldn't find any in a quick search on the internet. Similarly, we have major private corporations, especially IT corporations, moving into the aid to education area. Again, I don't know if this is the case for the large Korean companies. I couldn't find that to be so through quickly looking, but I do not claim, of course, to be an expert on that. What about Korean aid, official aid for education? Obviously, the country is moving from being a recipient to being a donor, with the commitment to join the Development Assistance Committee in next year, with the various commitments to increase the share of aid in the GNP. But yet the role of Korea with regard to aid for education still remains a bit unclear, frankly. What would Korea wish to do? Have this very important global scholarship program. You have some evidence of being very willing to participate in innovative financing, such as outside education, such as in the airline ticket tax program, and so on. But you have now a very huge opportunity as the G20 chair next year. The fourth trend I want to draw attention to has to do with a very worrying trend that the technical expertise of the traditional donors appears to be declining, with the odd exception. This, I think, is the result of a couple of things. The first has been that bilateral donors have been shifting, at least for basic education, more and more towards multilateral channels, including that fast-track initiative. And within their own bilateral programs, they've been also shifting more towards general budget support and away from specialized project and other types of education support. This has resulted in what is known in French aid as something called the Beggar Syndrome, named actually after a person who used to work at the World Bank called Birger Fredrickson, in which the specific education aid is more and more managed by people who are generalists, who are not themselves knowledgeable about education or education economics or relevant topics. This is very worrying, because it also can result in much less attention to technical issues and rather defeats one of the important purposes of aid. After all, there are several purposes of aid, resource transfer being one, but knowledge transfer being another. It is hard to do knowledge transfer through budget support. As I mentioned, there are some exceptions to this. The United States aid program, for example, is hiring a very large number of education specialists right now. The fifth trend I want to draw attention to is the growing role of South-South cooperation. This is, I think, critical for this point about the sharing of experience as well as for the supply of external funds. It is very much linked, I think, to the emergence of emerging economies, emerging donors. These are countries which are now trying to promote these ideas very strongly. Brazil, for example, pushing this very hard. China is beginning to. I believe there is a role for Korea here. But so far, the South-South cooperation, at least in education, appears to be mainly one of two things. Either regional, countries within one region promoting cooperation among themselves, or if it's global, it tends to be focused on helping the poorest countries in the world in Africa, where it tends to be particularly through the provision of finance. It's, of course, hard to quantify all of this, but I think that is the general picture. Having looked at all these various 5 trends, I now want to come to look at perhaps 5 issue areas that aid for education faces. The first is that I believe that there's an insufficient and indeed declining provision of what we might call global public goods in education, i.e. information which is useful to all countries, but which may not be in the interest of any one country alone to just produce. Such things as statistics, comparative performance assessments, research findings, cross-country sharing of experience, helping policymakers develop their own capacity to make policy, thinking about the future, these type of things. One can argue precisely whether these are global public goods or not, but there are certainly things which are of the benefit to everybody, but which few have an incentive to actually produce. This is complemented by the fact that there are now several agencies operating in this area of education and in these particular areas also, but yet there hasn't been a clear sorting out of who should do what. Various UN and other agencies, including UNESCO, World Bank, OECD, UNICEF, etc. The only area in which I think there is a pretty clear agreement is on statistics, where it's been pretty clearly agreed that the UNESCO Institute for Statistics takes the lead, working, of course, with many others in the provision of internationally comparable education statistics. The second issue I want to draw attention to has to do with this balance between finance and between knowledge. I do not think that the way that aid is currently provided for education sufficiently differentiates the different nature of the recipient countries. Clearly, the low-income countries need money, but they also need knowledge. The middle-income countries benefit mainly from knowledge, but occasionally also need finance. The high-income countries, though one doesn't often think of them as aid recipients, but if you think about this in a very broad way, certainly can benefit from knowing what goes on in other countries, again from knowledge. I've already mentioned that finance for the low-income countries is too low, in my view. It's also not predictable enough. Education, of course, is a long-term business. It's mainly, spending on education is mainly on people, on teachers. And no country is going to embark upon reforms unless they are sure that extra funding is becoming available. And finally, I think that knowledge is difficult to transfer, but must surely involve much more South-South cooperation. The third issue has to do with these countries affected by conflict. They may currently be in conflict, or they may have recently come out of it. But something like half the children in the world who are not in primary school are in such countries, and they represent a very major challenge, which everybody is talking about, but which we have not developed realistic mechanisms to deal with. And I think it's indeed linked to some of the broader global security issues, such as those that Professor Eichenberry was referring to. And here there's clearly, although I don't know the solution, a key role for NGOs. Fourth point I want to raise is, why does it seem to be so hard to get aid for education? Aid for education basically hasn't gone up as a share of overall aid, as I've indicated. It's much easier to get aid for health. It's becoming easier to get aid for infrastructure. I believe that one reason is it's just too obvious. That may seem strange, but I think it's not high enough on the global agenda. But if you think about the importance of education, how can the other items high on the global agenda, such as peace and security, such as sustainable economic growth, such as climate change, such as indeed as global health issues, how can these be achieved without educated people who are needed if behavioral change is to occur? Another strange aspect of the fact that it's hard to get aid for education is there's actually much more progress towards the education Millennium Development Goals than there is towards the health ones. Well, perhaps you could argue that's the reason why there isn't sufficient money available, because people believe that progress is occurring without it. But I think another important area is that education is especially basic education, has been very much thought of as being a national domain. For example, within the European Union, that is left to the individual member states. It's not something which operates at the European level. Similarly, within states, even within countries such as the United States, it's left to the state level. there's this very strong sense of ownership of education. But I believe that that is being misplacedly allocated, misplacedly used when we're talking about aid for education. Aid for education doesn't have to involve getting into such issues as the curriculum in a country, which is clearly a national sovereign matter. But it certainly could be used to help those countries make reforms in how their systems operate. Final question, what about future directions of aid? Well, I believe that the aid architecture for education needs pretty radical change. I think it would be useful to try as much as possible to multilateralize aid for basic education. This is happening, but as we saw, it's not increasing, and focus it particularly on the low-income countries. I think it would also be useful to define secondary education and adult literacy as clearly part of basic education. Currently, these are somewhat excluded, not completely, but somewhat excluded from many of the multilateral mechanisms, especially literacy tends to be excluded. I think this issue of how we support conflict-affected countries needs attention. I'd argue that bilateral aid can be particularly focused on higher education, where there are all types of mechanisms, institution to institution, that can be used. I argue for an increase in funding for global public goods in education, as I've indicated. I think that the very effective regional networks maybe are getting a bit obsolete as the world becomes one world, and we need to think about how transforming them into global ones, and as part of that, develop formal mechanisms for South-South cooperation. And so finally, to potential role for Korea. I've already referred, as have many others, to the opportunity that being the G20 chair presents. I think it's also important to remember what is Korea's own experience, a country in which clearly education has been one of the keys to its own development. So I would argue to Korea, don't copy other donors, but try to use your chairmanship of the G20 to lead the world, to add education explicitly back to the global agenda, and to earmark a significant portion of your own aid for education. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Burnett. Next is Dr. Jimenez.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the government of Korea, the Korea Economic Daily, and the other sponsors of this global HR forum for inviting me and the World Bank to address all of you, and also to have allowed us the honor of partnering with Korea in supporting representatives of education ministries in 9 East Asian countries to join you here. I think that if actions speak louder than words, it's an indication of the kind of learning that we believe Korea can offer to the rest of the world in ensuring that this partnership moves forward in the future. I am the 25th of a long line of distinguished speakers today, so that leaves me with a particular challenge of what more I would have to add. So I've been trying very hard to ensure that what I have to say has some value that might be added. And even for this session, it's been pretty difficult, starting with a very breathtaking, comprehensive view that Professor Eikenberry told us about in the global context, and Nick's very comprehensive view of the global aid architecture in education. Let me just go through 4 things. And as I said, what I'd like to do is to tell you about what others may not have pointed out in each of these points. One is, a lot of people have talked about the importance of innovation to stimulate economic growth, and that is absolutely true. The only thing I want to add to this is that this is a particular challenge, especially for the middle-income countries in the East Asia region. There is no secret to economic growth. In fact, the world had a Commission on Growth and Development led by a Nobel laureate named Michael Spence, who concluded that there is no generic formula for the policies that countries should follow in order to induce economic growth. But as Professor Feldstein mentioned, the ingredients are pretty clear. A lot of countries, for example, especially have achieved economic growth, especially those in East Asia, by using the factor of production that they have in abundance, labor, okay, and combining that with scarce capital for labor-intensive manufacturing. And that's how most countries have gone from low-income status to middle-income status. But in going from middle-income status to higher-income status, there are very few examples in the last few years, and Korea is certainly one of them. And here, most people believe that countries have to rely on something more than accumulating factors of production like labor and capital. It is productivity and innovation that are key to this. And perhaps nothing exemplifies this more than the Korean example. This graph shows the red line of Korean real GDP per capita, which was in fact in 1960 below that of Mexico, the green line. And as you all know, Korea surpassed Mexico sometime around the mid-1980s. But researchers have shown that the difference in the growth due to labor and capital accumulation alone is only a very small part of this difference. That's the blue line. The biggest part is through productivity growth, through knowledge accumulation in Korea, and that's why innovation and growth is so important, especially in breaking this glass ceiling from middle income to high income status. What drives this innovation? Well, there are two ways that people have talked about today. One is accumulating knowledge, and the other is using the accumulated knowledge through creativity in order to innovate. In accumulating knowledge, the most important direct source of this is research and development. It enhances the capacity for innovation and facilitates the assimilation of process and product technologies. One question a lot of finance ministers often ask is this investment productive? The evidence from Western countries is that the rate of return from R&D investments is in the 20 to 25% range. What about for other countries? It's very hard to actually assess innovation outputs. One way that is in a comparable way across countries. One way to do it is to look at how many U.S. patent and trade grants have countries been able to accumulate. And some researchers have done this just recently. As you can see from the bottom row of this, of course, the US and Japan, which devote a large part of their GDP to R&D, have in fact the largest number of patents from the US Patent and Trade Office per 100,000 people between 28 and 35. But the newly industrialized economies of Hong Kong, Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, China devoted almost as much of a proportion of their GDP to R&D. And you can see that the number of patents they have accumulated in the United States is now rivaling that of the US and Japan itself at about half. Other East Asian countries haven't devoted as much, but the rate of growth at which they've been accumulating patents has been pretty high as well. Another important aspect of how countries accumulate knowledge is openness. Aside from R&D, global interaction is very important as a conduit of knowledge and technology diffusion. 80% of the world's R&D comes from developed countries, and developing countries can't hope to match that. But they can benefit a lot from learning from the purchases of capital equipment and technology and industrial upgrading through exports. One estimate indicates that 1% of the R&D stock of industrialized countries raises output in developing countries by 0.5%. Finally, another measure of openness is foreign direct investment. Foreign affiliates of multinationals can obtain easier access to parent company technologies and can increase the productivity of economies through competition and through spillovers of technology and expertise. One recent study indicates that one standard deviation increase in foreign presence in the purchasing sector is associated with a 15% rise in output of local suppliers in developing countries. But of course, accumulating knowledge is not enough. Achieving innovation means also using that knowledge and applying it, and that requires creativity. One important aspect of creativity comes from society itself, whether it's a nurturing and environment, both culturally and socially. I often wonder, for example, what in other societies Bill Gates would have done had he also dropped out of the top college in that university of that country, and whether the society would have accepted somebody and given them the space to develop what he in fact did. But also importantly, as many speakers today have mentioned, is building human capital, education and better health starting from childhood, and indeed deepening that knowledge through specialization in the various subfields. So I want to go now through my third point, which is that what is the role of education and in this? And it's pivotal in absorbing R&D, in spending and technological know-how from abroad. But I just want to, other speakers have already mentioned this, but I just want to raise a couple of new points. One is that education at all levels is important in innovation. Primary education, as well as secondary, and finally, as many, in fact, the last session pointed out, higher education. In primary education has been key, for example, in some of the most important innovations in the world. As you know, in the past, there was a great concern, especially in the 1960s, about growing population, especially in developing countries. And there was this Malthusian fear that the world would run out of food. Well, they didn't count on productivity gains, and as you know, the Green Revolution developed high-yielding seed varieties that were developed at the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, as well as other places. What was important about this is that this Green Revolution was allowed to flourish because of the primary education in developing countries. In one study in India, for example, by Mark Rosenzweig, indicated that farmers who had no experience and no schooling incurred lower profits when they cultivated even the high-yield seeds. But schooling reduces the losses for inexperienced farmers. And of course, the profitability of new seeds rises more rapidly with experience for those farmers who were schooled than those who were non-schooled. So one important lesson is that innovation is helped even by very basic education. In secondary and technical vocational, what's really important is that it may be key to attracting high-tech industries that foster both creativity and innovation. And let me just tell you the story about Costa Rica and Intel. In 1996, Intel decided to build a new plant to assemble the latest Pentium microprocessors. This plant was going to hire up to 2,000 workers, and wages would account for about 25 to 30% of total costs. It needed a highly trainable technical workforce as well as high-level engineering, and also wanted to diversify out of Asia, where there were already assembly and testing plants in Malaysia, China, and the Philippines. Costa Rica was one of 4 Latin American countries it considered on the short list. Brazil, Chile, and Mexico were the others. Costa Rica was at the bottom of this list. It was by far not only the smallest at 33.5 million people, but it also had no experience in electronics at the time. But it had big pluses. It had a stable government, economic stability, and a regime of openness and dynamic leadership. But Intel's most pressing concern about Costa Rica was its relatively weak education infrastructure. Costa Rica had done a lot on primary, but really not enough on secondary and vocational. What Costa Rica did was put together a task force led by the president himself, consisting of the private sector, its Ministry of Education, its Ministry of Science and Technology, and its higher level Institute of Technology, to match the HR requirements of Intel in the curriculum of the secondary technical schools, and it actually added a year of certificate training to upgrade science training in those schools. And the Costa Rica Institute of Technology added language training in English as an independent major. So this is an example of how foreign direct investment stimulated innovations in education itself, so that there is, in fact, a two-way relationship in that. We already talked a lot about universities, so I will skip this, but simply to reiterate the point that was made in the last session, how universities are really key to to future innovation. So let me just again point out that what I see is a virtuous circle, that education is key to innovation, but innovation can also stimulate reforms in education for the future. The question is, how will foreign assistance, which is the topic of this session, help this? And again, a lot of the points have been made already by my good friend Nick Burnett, so I'll try to be very brief in the time remaining. I want to talk about two gaps. One is the knowledge gap, the financing gap that Nick talked about, and the other is the knowledge gap that Nick started to talk about. On the financing gap, it's pretty clear that in order to meet the MDGs, as Nick mentioned, more assistance is going to be needed. I won't talk about some of the estimates required to reach EFA, but some indicate that it's about $2 to $3 billion more than countries and donors already spend today. And Nick already talked about the EFA Fast Track initiative. But it is true that, as Nick mentioned, renewed effort is needed. Recent estimates that the bank has done indicate that a 1% increase in donor country incomes will lead to 1.5% to 3% increase in per capita aid flows. The same token, a 1% decline in those incomes might lead to a 1.5% to 3% decline in per capita aid flows, which just reiterates the point that he already made. But I also want to talk about the knowledge gaps that befall countries. There are huge differences across countries in what children are learning. So even as countries converge in reaching a universal primary education, this is a huge challenge of what the kids actually learn when they're in school. The other point that's been made time and again this morning and all day today is that learning for the new economy is changing very rapidly. Let me just briefly go through each of these points. Now, it's very hard to compare quality across countries, as you all know. There are tests that are not comparable across countries. There have been a few, such as TIMSS and PISA, but they're only limited to a few countries. But two researchers, Rick Hanishek and Ludger Hausman, have tried to combine with an index by looking at all the test scores that have been available in about 77 countries to be roughly comparable across them. And what they came up with is what percent of different populations reach certain thresholds. And this black horizontal line indicates what they consider a basic threshold for functionality, or score of about 400. And as you can see, some countries do very well, some countries do very poorly. Okay? Korea and Japan are way up there in terms of the very small proportion who don't meet that threshold. And Brazil and Peru indicate countries which have very large populations that don't meet that threshold of basic functioning. As we all know from the talks today, the knowledge that is going to be needed for the future is changing very rapidly. This is a graph from Dick Murnane. It's about 10 years old now, but it's truer today than even before, in which the functionings of routine manual and routine cognitive skills are in fact going down in the workforce, but expert thinking and complex communication are increasing. So with these rapidly evolving challenges, what can international assistance do? Countries can learn good practices from others, and let me just give you a couple of examples of where I believe international assistance has actually helped countries come up with new ideas in education. One is on demand-side interventions. Until recently, most of the foreign assistance in education has been through building schools, providing textbooks, but countries have found out that that's not going to be enough. If you build them, they may come, but they may not learn anything, or they may not come at all because of the constraints that families face on incomes. So these interventions work on the demand side by providing transfers to families themselves, but conditional on children going to school. This is first tried out in Mexico, and it's now spreading rapidly around the world. In fact, it's now spread to the developed countries, because New York City has just started, based on the Mexico program, its own conditional cash transfer program to keep kids in high schools in New York City. Another example is school-based management, where a lot of countries are taking examples from innovations done in countries in Latin America and some parts of Asia, in which schools are given a lot of leeway in adapting to local conditions by supporting village education councils in ensuring that principals have the right incentives to manage the schools properly. I think in Korea, there are a lot of examples where I see, from what I've learned just in the past couple of days, Korea can help a lot in providing these ideas. For example, Korea has been very important in giving incentives to teachers to ensure that they are seen as the teaching profession is one of high status. The rest of the world can learn a lot from the phased approach that Korea took in investing in primary education and then secondary and now higher education that is consistent with their economic context. Let me just add a couple of things to what Nick had to say, though, about how countries like Korea can contribute even further for the future. And I won't add to what he already mentioned about the need to help the development community bridge the financing gap. There are a number of challenges, I think, that the development partners face that Korea will confront as we move forward. One is the issue of harmonization with other donors. And I think that one of the things that donor partners, including the World Bank, have to do is to make sure that when aid is given, that it is done as simply as possible. And it simply can't be the case that each donor has its own agenda in terms of ensuring that the accounting and the procurement rules meet the country needs. Another is contributing to FTI and other international funds. Certainly, from my point of view, in the countries in East Asia and the Pacific, our experience with FTI has been more positive than perhaps Nick might have mentioned, based on his experience in poorer countries, certainly in Mongolia, Cambodia, and now Lao PDR. We just need more funds in order to get going on this. Nick already mentioned the need to partner on knowledge products. I won't go into that. I do believe his point about the need for the international community to focus on global public goods such as statistics and, in fact, measuring quality is going to be key for the future. And finally, to champion the results agenda. I know Nick's now in the results agenda world, but it's going to be important because many finance ministries are going to be asking, what are they getting for the investments that they're going to be making in education for the future? And I believe Korea will ask the same question as it moves forward. So let me just summarize by saying that I try to make 4 points. One is that innovation is key to stimulating and sustaining growth, but especially as countries move and try to break that glass ceiling from middle income to high income status. That the drivers of innovation are knowledge accumulation and creativity, but the degree of openness in an economy is very important to doing that. And that there's a virtuous circle, perhaps, in which education can stimulate innovation, but innovation itself can drive reforms and innovation in education. And finally, I believe that further global interaction can enhance education's role in stimulating creativity, and I join the call for others, for Korea, to use this opportunity of its G20 chairmanship to champion this. We've already had some great experience with Korea in partnering with the World Bank. We hope that you can do more. Thank you very much. 감사합니다.
Thank you, Dr. Jimenez. The mission that this plenary session 4 should discuss has 2 pillars. One is discussing how the global economic order will be changed after financial meltdown. Second one is presenting ideas about Korea's leadership as one of Asia's economic powers. Since we have discussed very well about the first pillar, if you allow me, I will mention about what the Korean government is doing. As you know, Korea has become the first country in this era from the country where they received assistance, donation from other countries, recipient of donation, to donor of those assistance. Because Korean economic development has been very high, with 220,000 per capita income, with 50 million population. Except Korea, there are only 6 countries with these 2 criteria. One is United States, Japan, Germany, UK, France, and Italy. Because of that status, Korea tried to give many assistance possible to other countries. We tried to increase our ODA assistance 3 times within 5 years. And then also we have not only those kind of monetary assistance, we have technical assistance, which is called knowledge sharing program, because Korea is the only country which could develop within short time. Really, it's condensed economic development. Korea could achieve with only 30 years for the work that UK has done for 300 years. So that a lot of developing countries in Asia and Africa and even Latin America want to learn how to develop their countries. So that we are providing those technical assistance. In this year, we have given that assistance to Vietnam, and next year we are going to expand to 4 countries, including Indonesia, Nepal, Uzbekistan, and Cambodia. Maybe 2 years later, we are going to increase to 8 countries. By doing that way, we will increase those donation countries to more than 20 years within 3 years. And second one is that not only that kind of monetary and technical assistance, but also there are a lot of volunteers. You know about American Peace Corps and Japanese JICA. In fact, out of 120 UN nation memberships, Korea is the 3rd country where we dispatch those volunteers with annually 4,000 volunteers all over the world, including IT specialists, language teachers, and then medical doctors. Also, we are going to increase that number triple within 5 years. And in terms of education, as you may know, from this year on, next year, the budget for world scholarship has been doubled so that we could invite high school and college students to Korea, double compared to this year's invitation. Also, like the case of EU, where they have Erasmus plan, Japan, China, and Korea will formulate similar kind of organization so that we could exchange college students for 1 semester, 1 year. So really, we try to repay what we have got from other developed countries during the process of economic development. That's the status quo of Korea. With this kind of thing in mind, let's discuss about what further we could do. Or you could ask, or you could discuss, or you could debate. Unfortunately, we have only 8 minutes to go. So that I can invite comments, questions from floor. Instead of doing that, I'll give you, the panel participants 3 minutes each, and then give any final comments. Yeah, any person.
Well, this has been an interesting panel, and I've learned a great deal. I'm someone who studies international relations in 100-year segments, so I have been flying at a high level over the ground and learned a great deal about aid and education. Let me just make 2 general conclusions, I think, from my own perspective on the shifting foundations of global cooperation and governance. The first is simply that we are in the midst of a period of great innovation and change in the nature of governance. That is to say, in the way in which governments around the world cooperate to achieve common ends. There is a growth in new, more capable states that are joining the ranks of donors. Recipient countries are turning into donor countries. What at the State Department is called the high-capacity democracies are now a larger group than ever before. These are countries that have the kind of wealth and assets to work together in new ways to attack problems of underdevelopment and poverty and weak state governance around the world, which are increasingly the source of the concerns we have about security and prosperity. So the nature of governance is changing, and Korea is really, in some sense, in the vanguard of that. Secondly, this other conclusion really draws on the other theme that's been on this panel, but also been in the room today, and that is about education. And at a very micro level, those of us who live in university communities see a second transformation in the way in which our universities think about education. What's needed to make young people equipped to enter the 21st century. And increasingly that demand is for much more sophisticated international education, which means that we need to be creating more pathways of interaction across countries through universities. At Princeton, we've changed the name or the motto of our university. For several hundred years, Princeton was a university in the nation's service, and now the motto is in the nation's service and in the service of all nations, recognizing in this symbolic way the sense that the university has to adapt and be an international institution to take advantage, but also to address the demands of the 21st century. So the nature of governance is changing, very exciting. On balance, as I try to argue in my lecture, it's for the good, and you see the system responding to new actors and new functional demands. And at a different level of society around the world, universities are finding themselves having to reinvent themselves for the 21st century as well. So with that, I will pass things over to my colleagues.
Thank you. Well, I think I'd just reiterate two simple points. The first is that, Korea's own success is so based upon education that, coming to the second point, given Korea's emerging role in the world economy and more generally in the world, surely these 2 points should be linked. And this means that Korea is poised to play, if it chooses to do so, an outstanding role with regard to international assistance for education. Because here is a country which has shifted from being a recipient to now being a donor, which has itself invested in education, and this has been a key part of the country's success. And this occurs at a time when there is, frankly, no clear spokesperson, no clear set of countries even who are really speaking for the developing countries in the international education, in the various international education fora. So I think that there is a real opportunity here waiting just to be seized by Korea, and I do hope that you do it. Thank you.
As Korea moves forward, of course, contributions to these funds will help. Money always helps. But I think what's more important is that Korea, as it becomes a donor, will have not just financial leverage, but it will also have convening authority. And I think people have said today how Korea is really well poised, not just because of its G20 chairmanship, but the fact that it commands respect from having been one of the few countries that broke that glass ceiling from middle income to high income countries recently. And I know that many countries in the region, but also in Africa and elsewhere, are looking for examples. So ways in which Korea can bridge that knowledge gap are going to be important, aside from its financing And in doing that, I think that the partnerships that you are embarking on, including workshops like this one, are a start for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Read speech by both Dr. Jimenez and Dr. Burnett. We have learned that one of the important reasons why Korean economy could be developed is because of higher education and quality of education. However, interesting thing is that according to recent survey of country competitiveness by WEF, World Economic Forum, one of the reasons Korea does not have an advantage is higher education. That's a contradiction. The reason is very simple, because the score, the index has been derived from interview to Koreans only, not international audience. So that the demand, the GF for education in Korea is so high, so that they are disappointed with what Korean universities and high schools are doing. So that's a very long conception. The second thing is that, as you know very well, 84% of high school graduates are going to university, one of the largest number. That's a really contribution for R&D, other advanced technology in Korea. With that wealth of higher education, we should try to provide those knowledge and experience to the other developing country in Asia, in Africa. And then, as you know, next year we will coordinate G20 summit meeting in November in Seoul. We'll try to put, as Professor mentioned, Burnett mentioned, not only economic matters, but also other matters, including environment development, green development, and education. We'll try it very hard. Thank you very much for your attendance, and actually we have a lot learned from those eminent professors and specialists, and let's give them big hands.
And also a big round of applause to our moderator today, Chairman Oh Yoon-dae from the Presidential Council on Nation Branding. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Well, this concludes all the plenary sessions that we have had for today. I'm sure that all of you had a very, very long day, because we did learn a lot, not from the presenter's point of view, but also from the speakers and also everyone who participated in the discussion, and also myself. I hope to see many of you back again tomorrow, as we have more great programs with great speakers. So please refer to your program book and see if you find any specific themes that attract your attention. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you very much.